All right, very good. Okay, so now that we are done with the announcements, here's the agenda for today's session. It's not moving. Okay, so I'm going to do a pretty quick review. It's probably going to last about 30 minutes, 40 minutes or so. Obviously, not enough time to go through all the details of everything that we've covered. We've covered a lot of concepts, as you guys know, but it'll at least be a little bit of a refresher. And as I'm going through this review, if there is something that you've not fully understood or you have not forgotten, just feel free to ask me a question about it. And we will try and kind of work out the answer as a group. Okay, so if somebody asks a question, I'm going to first turn to you all to see if anybody remembers the answer to the question, and I'll also chime in with my own comments. Okay, so that'll be about, say, max 45 minutes, which will leave us with about 25 minutes at the end. So of those 25 minutes, I'm going to take about 15 minutes for you guys to do a mock exam. We have copies of the mock exam here. It has 5 multiple choice questions and 1 short essay question, but it'll give you a pretty good flavor for what the final exam is going to look like, okay, which is going to have 40 multiple choice questions and 3 short essay questions, out of which you have to answer 2, at least 2. You can answer all 3 if you have time, and we'll take the best 2, but you have to answer at least 2. Okay, and then we'll go through the answers. I'll do a quick review of the mock exam question answers, okay? All right, so where did we begin? We began with a definition of consumer behavior, right? You'll remember that you can define consumer behavior as a study, and what's it a study of? It's a study of consumers' decisions in the short term, right? How do consumers choose what to buy or not to buy, or maybe they want to delay consumption, whatever it is, right? And consumption is a very broad, it gives you a very, very broad kind of big tent, right? I mean, you can think about consumption of products and services, obviously, but you can also think about consumption of ideas, right? Right now, we are in the election season, and so both the parties are trying to sell us why they are the superior choice, right? So that's an idea that they're trying to sell. They're trying to sell a kind of almost like a philosophy, if you will, of how countries should be ruled or what are good policies to have. All of those are ideas. They're not actual tangible products, nor are they really services like a bank or a cruise, right? So consumer behavior is a study of how we make decisions about what products to buy or what ideas to subscribe to in the short term. It's also the study of consumers' more medium-term satisfaction. You'll remember that we discussed satisfaction as an attitude based on actual experience, which I'll get to a little bit later too. And finally, it's also the study of even longer-term kind of branding, right? So the set of associations that people have with brands tend to last a really long time, and people might make decisions to buy a particular brand, even if they have kind of forgotten about the attributes of the brand, just because they tend to have a positive emotional connection with the brand, etc. Okay, so we began with the first and spent a lot of time on it, actually. And if you look at how consumers make decisions, typically there is a journey that they go on. You can think about it in the metaphor of a journey going from the starting point to a destination, right? The destination being buying the product or the brand, and the starting point being recognition that they have a need or a problem, right? And so we went through all of these stages, and I want to very quickly kind of talk about some of the main points we talked about in each of these stages. So in need recognition, typically, what marketers try to do is to highlight a discrepancy between the consumer's actual state and an ideal state. And so they have really kind of 3 strategies that they can use. One of those is to lower the perception of actual state, right? So make consumers feel that, your life right now is not great, right? You're not as good looking, perhaps, or you're not as hygienic. Your kitchen sink is dirty, right? You're not getting as good a sleep as you could get. Your actual state kind of sucks, okay? That's one strategy, broadly put. The other strategy is, of course, to elevate the ideal state. So your actual state might not be bad, but ideally you could be in an even better state. By the way, I went to Barton Creek Mall the other day because did I tell you guys that I got mugged in New Orleans or no? Okay. All right. Anyway, so I had to change everything up. And so I had to go to the Apple store to, reset my password, etc. They weren't able to do it offline. And I tried out the Apple Pro Vision VR goggles. They're amazing. So Eric is nodding really vigorously. So I imagine that you've tried it too. Yeah, isn't it amazing? Yeah. So when I look at my TV right now, right at home, and I have a really nice TV, a big 85-inch, Samsung frame, it's called. It's beautiful. And I think to myself, how can things get better than this, right? But things can get better, and you try on these VR goggles, you feel like, and this one kind of snip, obviously they've chosen videos and things like that really portray the product in the best light possible, but it's just amazing. It feels like I'm actually at the jazz bar, sitting right next to the pianist as she's playing the piano and singing, crooning into the mic. It's just amazing. Some of these 3D videos are just amazing, and that's what's coming up in our future, right? I mean, not even that far. You guys are obviously going to see even more, fancy stuff, but even in my lifetime, I'm going to see a lot of stuff like this. So, you don't have to make people feel bad about the actual state. The actual state right now is good, but the ideal state could be even better, right? So that's another way in which you could engender or trigger needs. Of course, you can do both, right? We talked about some examples of those where you show people a low actual state and a high ideal state, right? Before, after kind of advertisements do it. We talked a little bit about this idea of, needs being internally generated versus externally generated. You could have a need pop up in your mind because your body's signaling it. You're hungry, for example, right? Or you could see an ad and say, you know what, I'm hungry, right? I could do with some tater tots right now, for example. Needs can be time dependent, right? So needs that we used to have back in the day, perhaps are not the same needs that we have now. They can be culture dependent across cultures, across contexts, right? So if you're in a classroom, you might have a certain set of needs. If you're at the same time in a kind of public park, you might have a different set of needs. We also talked about this idea of equifinality of needs. So the same need can be satisfied in many different ways, which then gives you as a marketer kind of some leeway in getting the consumer to kind of try out your product for a particular need, right? But it also points out that we need to stay humble because, just because a consumer has a need and you satisfy that need doesn't automatically mean that they're going to buy your product. They might have other ways in which to satisfy that need, right? If you're bored, you could satisfy that need through watching Netflix. You could satisfy that need through going for a run or working out at the gym or going on a dating app, what have you. Okay, so the next stage is information search, right? And information search typically occurs right after a need is generated or triggered, and consumers are obviously looking for solutions that will fulfill that need. And that stage is, it comes in two varieties. So one is internal search. So you could kind of like look for options that fulfill that need from your memory, right? And here we talked a little bit about this idea that if a brand comes to mind, top of mind, right? It's very familiar. And as soon as you have that need, that's the brand that comes to mind. If you feel like you want to drink water, and the first brand that comes to mind is Aquafina, right? It's top of mind. It's called unaided recall, right? Of course, you could also have aided recall if you're feeling thirsty, but Aquafina is not top of mind. But you ask the consumer who's thirsty, do you know of this brand? And they say, yes, I do. So you at least want to be in the aided recall, right? Ideally, you want to be top of mind or unaided recall. And that confers upon the brand a lot of advantages. Obviously, it enters the consideration set. There's a high chance that you actually buy the brand that comes to you without being aided. Yeah.
So what's the difference between unaided and aided recall? Or are they the same?
Unaided.
Aided recall.
Unaided is without aid or without help, right? If something comes to mind without the marketer telling you, hey, have you heard of Aquafina, right? And aided is when you're helped, your memory is jogged,
Okay.
right? Yeah, so that's the difference. So the reason why I put it up here is because as a market kind of researcher, right, or a brand manager, you want to be aware of where you stand in consumers' memories and minds. And is your brand top of mind, right? So is it at least, even if not top of mind or unaided, is it at least coming to people's minds if you kind of jog their memory or you remind them of your brand, right? So that's the idea. And in the internal search, people not only think of brand names, but they also think of brand attributes. What are the set of features associated with a particular brand? If you think of Aquafina, for example, one of the attributes that might come to mind is that it's a brand owned by Pepsi, right? And if you have positive associations with Pepsi, then you might think, okay, Aquafina must be a good quality brand too. You might also think that Aquafina comes generally in plastic bottles that are pretty sturdy, as opposed to some of the other brands like Ozarka, right? That seems to come in more thin bottles, and you might like thicker bottles than thin bottles. That might be another kind of quality attribution that you make, etc. So when you do the internal search, brand names come to mind, attributes come to mind, attitudes come to mind. Do I like this brand versus not? Of course, you can also engage in external search, and external searches are becoming even more prevalent now with Google, especially Google, but also other search engines. There's this concept of digital amnesia that we talked about a little bit, that just because you're able to access information so easily through the internet, you believe that you actually know more than you do, right? So it's particularly important for brands these days to not take for granted that consumers are going to think of your brand if they have a particular need because of digital amnesia. People might think that they'll remember a brand or remember a product that will fulfill a need. But in fact, unless there is Google or unless there is some search engine around them, they may not. And that's why search engine optimization becomes really big, right? Which we haven't really talked about, but that's one of the big reasons why it's so important to know about SEO. Yeah. We're comparing what with what?
Something just outside the sidewalk.
Yeah.
But would it also happen like when I'm external search for something, I might get an unaided recall for something else?
Yeah, you might.
Does that
You might. So the thing is that as a brand manager or a marketer, right, when a consumer has a need, if your brand comes to their mind without even having that brand be out in the open, right, in front of them, then obviously that's likely to increase the chances that that particular consumer is going to buy that brand, right? So at the very least, you want consumers to recognize your brand once you see it. Let's say that you're thirsty and you're walking around an ACL, Austin City Limits, right? And you see an Aquafina ad there, right? If you recognize the brand, the chances are higher that you might actually buy it. But if it comes to mind even without seeing that cue, then you're in a better position. Did I answer your question?
I was just saying, like, in general, like, when I'm doing an external search, there are a lot of times when, like, I get an unaided recall for some other thing. Like, I might look for a water bottle, but I'll see, like, for example, I'll be searching for Canadian, but then I'll see a stand, and I'm like, oh, I know both. Does that happen a lot where it's like both the external search and the unaided recall happen?
Yeah, so you have to kind of look at your own experiences, right? Obviously it happens. So you might think of a brand and you might also do a search, just to make sure that, you're buying the best brand or something. And then you might see other brands that come up there. And then you have to make a decision between those, right? And here, I think it's actually a good segue into the next thing, right? Next stage, which is decision making. So here we talked about how consumers tend to make decisions a little bit differently when it's in a high effort context. And high effort contexts are characterized by high levels of motivation and ability and opportunity. And low effort contexts have low motivation or ability or opportunity. So if any of these three things is missing, that becomes a low effort context in general, okay? And how do consumers make decisions in high effort contexts? They typically, one assumes, right? Researchers assume that consumers tend to go through what's called a TORA model. The steps in the TORA model, and the steps are the ones here on the screen, right? So you first gather information, and then you come up with ratings on a 1 to 9 scale or a 1 to 100 scale, whatever scale that consumers use in their own heads. It could be different across different consumers. The performance of the brand on various attributes, as well as the importance of the attributes. And then we assume that they multiply those two numbers and come up with attribute level utilities. And then they add up the utilities across all the attributes to calculate the overall utility that a particular option provides. And if they do the same process across all the options that are there, then one of the options presumably wins. And in other words, it gives you the highest utility, gives that consumer the highest utility. They presumably choose that brand. Yes, Sarah.
So this is kind of related, but you said that the quizzes were all going to be open.
Yeah.
But like, I don't.
As open as in like you can bring all your notes, etc., but not digital devices.
No, right. So if you like write them down, things like that. I think quiz 3 was about the tour model, and I was trying to go look back at it, and that wasn't open.
Oh, it wasn't open?
Or 4. I don't know.
Okay, so we can actually do it right at the end of class today to make sure that everybody is able to access all the open. So, so which quizzes were open?
2 was open. I know that you said 1 and 15 you're having trouble with opening in the email, but I was trying to go through it, and 2 was open, but 3 and 4 weren't. So nice and kind of looking.
Okay, all right. Let's make sure that all the quizzes are open. Okay, yeah. Okay, so then we talked a little bit about Torah as a diagnostic tool, and here, this picture is kind of useful. So you can think about using the Torah model to understand what it is that you as a marketer could do in order to enhance your market share or profits. So basically, the idea here is that if you're a manager, you can administer surveys to consumers. Let's say that you administer a survey to 100 consumers, and you're a laptop brand, for example, right? So you might figure out from that from those 100 respondents' inputs how well you're doing on various attributes and which attributes are the most important, right? So you can kind of like figure out how important a particular attribute is, right? Not important to very important, and also how well you're doing. Let's say processor speed, presumably that's an important attribute, and you might be not so good, right? Your performance might be bad relative to the competition. So once you come up with this matrix and you're able to populate each of these 4 cells, then you can actually take some action, right? So if the performance is bad, but the attribute is not important, nobody really kind of cares about that particular attribute, right? Then you don't need to do anything, right? If the performance is good, but the attribute is currently not thought of as being important, then perhaps you can kind of elevate the perceived importance of that particular attribute. We talked about a couple of examples here in the context of Heineken, for example. They steam all their bottles, and they actually tout it in one of their advertisements, right? So it was not an attribute that the consumers thought was important, but after the advertisements, after exposure to the advertisements, some of the consumers at least thought, okay, that's important. That makes Heineken more hygienic. Now it's another matter that every bottler, every beer manufacturer does it, but Heineken kind of was the first to actually advertise it. If the attribute is important and the performance is good, there is always new consumers coming into the marketplace, right? People are growing older by the day, and so people who may not have bought your product before might now be in the target segment for it. So it's important to continue to advertise, right? So that it's kind of in top of mind again. Yeah, Sarah? Yeah, I think that, you can think about it both in terms of absolute terms and in relative terms. So, if a product just does really well, it's very reliable, right? And you don't really have experience with other products. Let's say you own a Honda car, right? You've always owned Hondas. Your family has owned Hondas. You don't really have much experience with other cars, but in general, it's very reliable, rarely needs any maintenance, etc. You might say, you know what, on reliability, this performs really well, right? But you could also think about performance ratings as being relative. So the more you get to know about other cars and how much they break down, maybe your assessment of Honda's reliability goes up even more. Okay. In general, I think people do a relative comparison a lot, right? Particularly in countries or contexts in which there is a lot of options available to people, right? So we are aware of a lot of different brands and performances of different brands. So it's relative comparisons that usually kind of dictates what numbers people come up with to rate attributes. Here's where most of the action is, right? Where the performance is bad and the attribute is good. So you can add new attributes and highlight their importance. You can change beliefs about existing attributes. You can also compare with competition. I walked you through some examples. You can go back and take a look at the slides, okay? All right, so we also talked about non-compensatory models in the high effort decision contexts. So the reason why we talked about this is because of an acknowledgement of a real life situation, which is that oftentimes you have too much information. You have too many brands, too many options to choose from. You have a plethora of attributes, and it's difficult to kind of compute using the Torah model, which option wins, right? People just don't have the time or energy to do it. And that's where non-compensatory models come in. And non-compensatory models basically say that people use these so-called cutoffs. And conjunctive rule says that the cutoffs are applied across all the important attributes. We talked about how in the context of choosing a vacation, you might want to go to a place which is below a certain amount of money in terms of cost, a place that has sufficiently decent food, for example, or nightlife, right? So if you apply cutoffs across all important attributes, that's called a conjunctive rule. A disjunctive is when you apply cutoffs on any one attribute, right? To say that either it's going to have to be really cheap, or it's going to have a fantastic nightlife, right? Or fantastic food. So if any of these apply, I'll consider it, right? In conjunctive, all of these need to apply. So it's an and rule. Disjunctive is any of these apply. So in other words, it's an or rule. Okay, so how do consumers in general in the world make decisions? So a lot of researchers believe that consumers first use non-compensatory models in order to kind of make a shortlist, what's called a consideration set, a smaller number of brands or options first. And then on the ones that survive, once you use those non-compensatory rules, then you might use a compensatory or a Torah model kind of a way of selecting the best option. All right, so that's high effort contexts. In low effort contexts, what happens is that people don't really feel as motivated to expend a lot of time and effort, right? Because the consequences are not that high. Low effort contexts in general tend to be low priced items like toothbrushes or detergents or toilet paper. And even if you buy a bad product or brand, it's no big deal, right? So you go through that particular product, and then the next time around, you're not going to buy that product. Okay, so over time, over lots of decisions, over multiple months or at least weeks, people kind of gravitate toward a brand that they like, okay? And they end up using these so-called choice heuristics. In these contexts, these are rules of thumb that cut down effort and time by a significant amount without really sacrificing accuracy to a great extent. So over time, you might end up choosing the cheapest brand, or because you think that every brand is above a certain required level of quality for me. I don't really care. Every toothbrush is basically the same. So I'm just going to buy the cheapest, right? Or it could be the brand that I've always bought before, right? I'm just loyal to it. I just love it, right? That's an affective heuristic. Buy the cheapest brand is a cognitive heuristic. And the marketing implication here is that as a player in a low effort category, right? So low effort category, again, generally speaking, these are low priced items or items that, there's just a lot of different undifferentiated options available in these categories. So as a player in this kind of a category, you want to highlight one max two attributes to market these brands, right? So this is what you see in the cereals category, for example. They'll advertise a particular attribute. The muesli is, for example, it's got all these fruits and nuts, right? Etc. So that's the idea here. Okay, then we moved on to a module that talked about attention and memory and categorization, right? And you can think about these as not necessarily restricted to marketing contexts. It's really about how our mind functions, okay? How do we go about learning things? How do we go about making decisions in life in general? And obviously, it's also going to have implications for marketing. And the idea here is that if you think about what enters our attention field, what it is that we choose to actually pay attention to, there are some restrictions that we face, right? So one restriction is attention seems to be limited, right? We could be exposed to a lot of information. Right now, we're exposed to a field of 180-degree, field of visual information that's coming at us, but we don't have the capacity to process everything, right? So we tend to kind of shine the flashlight of attention on one particular area, and everything else is dark, so to speak. Okay, so we can only pay attention to about 5 things at one time. It seems like, right? 5 bits of information, as it's called. You might remember that article that I gave you to read. Right, attention is limited, and on top of that, if you talk about problems that marketers face in particular, there is a lot of clutter. In a country like the United States, in general, in capitalistic countries, there are just a lot of options available. And so you have to then advertise in order to catch people's attention. And if everybody does it, that creates clutter, right? So that makes it even more difficult for the consumer to pay attention to a particular product. And on top of it, there is a big mega trend that's going on whereby people are busier and busier, and there is just a lot of things that are trying to grab their attention. And I think the introduction of the cell phones in particular has been a big kind of a milestone here, right? So we have so much going on in our cell phones. It's constantly trying to grab our attention, and we are willingly giving it to it, right? Because, it's personally relevant for us. There's text messages coming in, there's email, there is movies that we can watch on it, there's music we can listen to on it, and we can take pictures and so on and so forth, right? So all of these mean basically that whatever attention that we used to have before, it's even more constricted, which means that we are operating under a lot of cognitive load. And when we operate under a lot of cognitive load, in other words, there's a lot going on in our head, we tend to kind of follow our heart, right? So we might make decisions to buy or consume a cake, which is more emotionally appealing to us than a fruit salad, which might confer health benefits, but they're more long-term, right? But when we are kind of thinking and distracted a lot, then we tend to go with our emotions. So we talked a little bit about cognitive load and decision fatigue and how we make decisions in those contexts. So as a marketer, what can you do? So there are 2 kinds of general strategies that you can use. One is to appeal to the consumer's goals, right? Make it relevant to the consumer. And how can you do this? There are certain things that are relevant to almost everybody. Just because you're a human being, you're going to find babies cute in general, right? You're going to find animals to be cute. You're going to be attracted to music that is, that sounds good as opposed to is cacophonic, etc. So that's general relevance. So you can appeal to the general relevance, and you can look at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs here, right? So you can appeal to their safety needs, or you can appeal to their ego needs, status needs, and so on and so forth. You can make it personally relevant. And now with big data and the ability to kind of like, actually monitor people's past purchases and so on, you might be able to figure out, what's this person's sort of personally relevant goals. So if you see that somebody is spending a lot of money staying at 5-star hotels across the world, then you might conclude that, okay, this person likes to live it up and they like to travel a lot, right? So that's personally relevant to them, that particular category. If you know that they were born in a certain year, let's say 1974, then things from 1974 are going to be personally relevant to them, presumably, right? So that's personal relevance as opposed to general relevance. And of course, you can also look at task or situational relevance, right? If they're on work somewhere, visiting a city, then their set of goals might be a little bit different than if they were visiting a place on vacation with their family. Okay, so you can do that, or you can do a bottom-up, right? So it's not trying to appeal to their goals as much as you're just trying to grab their attention just by being big or being loud or being different, right? So we talked about prominence and contrast in that context. So that's attention. Then we moved on to memory. And memory is super important, right? So if you think about what I talked about earlier, unaided recall, right? We're really talking about memory. Are people able to bring your brand to mind when they think about a particular product category? So memory is important when it comes to information search, right? Memory is also important when you think about the Torah model, right? So it's not as if we sit down and calculate how well a brand is performing on various attributes every single time we encounter the brand. We presumably pull some information from our memory, right? Apple products in general tend to do well, and that's something that we bring from memory. So memory is very important across the stages of the consumer journey. The problem is memory tends to decay over time, right? And this might be particularly true in current day, right? Because, there's just, again, so much competing for our attention that, that also affects our ability to remember things. Why it's stopped again. Share one more time. Okay. All right. So it's also susceptible to some other kinds of quirks, if you want to call them, or potential problems that marketers might face. So one of these is interference effects, right? So the idea here is that if you're a MasterCard and you advertise MasterCard or you sponsor the Olympics, it may not necessarily only result in people remembering MasterCard, right? Or bringing to mind MasterCard more in unaided recall. It might inadvertently, right? And really kind of somewhat unfortunately, make it more likely that Visa is brought to mind, right? So these are called interference effects. And the reason why it happens is because of the associative network, right? So this is how a general associative network might look like when it comes to McDonald's, right? Different things are linked to McDonald's. So when Burger King advertises, right? So not only does it make Burger King more salient, it also makes McDonald's more salient. In general, the market leader is likely to be activated whenever a market follower tends to be brought to mind or advertised. So that's the idea here that, if you're MasterCard and you're number 2 or number 3 even, right, in the marketplace, and Visa is clearly number 1, then when MasterCard advertises or sponsors the Olympics, then people might bring to mind Visa as well. Likewise, if Kodak were to advertise, Canon might be brought to mind. So these are called interference effects. Okay, so something to watch out for, particularly if you're not the market leader. There's also confirmation bias that happens. So the idea here is that if the consumer entertains a certain hypothesis about a certain brand, they are likely to confirm that. So you can actually, as a marketer, seed the consumer's mind with certain hypotheses, which is what a lot of advertisers do, right? So if you think about Lexus, the relentless pursuit of perfection, right? So that's their tagline. And what they're trying to say is that our products are perfect, right? And if the consumer believes that or remembers that about Lexus, the next time that they encounter this brand, they are likely to confirm it. Okay, so that's how our mind operates and memory operates. So we tend to confirm things rather than disconfirm things in general. But there are exceptions to it, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And then we also talked a little bit about the so-called sleeper effects, where people forget the source of information. All they remember is the information, right? So they might remember that airborne kills viruses or is good to take when you are about to fly somewhere. You're less likely to fall sick. Even though the FDA has actually found out that airborne has no effect whatsoever. But if people remember that, then they might forget that the source was the advertiser, right? In general, we tend to discount what advertisers say because there's conflict of interest. They want to make money, right? They're obviously going to claim something that's a bit of an exaggeration, perhaps. But if you forget who the source was, then it might actually benefit the advertiser. Over time, all they remember is airborne is good for you when you're about to fly somewhere. Okay. So those are some kind of aspects of memory. So given these problems that memory tends to decay over time, there's interference effect and so on, and people don't have infinite memory, what can marketers do? So we talked about a bunch of different strategies that they can use. Chunking is one, right? 1-800-HAMPTON, right? You don't have to remember Hampton's number. All you have to remember is that it's 1-800-HAMPTON, right? So that's chunking. Imagery. So we talked about how Apple, again, MacBook Air, they don't have to kind of tout how light they are. They can just show the product kind of almost levitating in an advertisement. And that conveys this information that it's really light. Talked about repetition and recirculation. I'm sure you remember head on, right? Fly directly on your head, right? So that's repetition. Recirculation is where you take a certain concept and then kind of show different facets of it. So for example, the Absolute vodka advertisements have the shape of the bottle. They don't necessarily have the bottle itself, but they'll have the shape of the bottle in different kinds of images. That's recirculation. I showed this ad for encouraging elaboration for a wind farm or a windmill source of electricity called Epuron, where wind is a character in the video, and he goes around saying that everybody gives me a bad rap. But suddenly this guy came and he was from the energy field, and now I'm being praised, right? I'm being given the importance that I deserved all along. So that's encouraging elaboration. Can use emotions. I might remember the Budweiser ad with the dogs and the dog, I should say, and the horses. Okay, so various ways in which you can improve consumer memory. And many of these effectiveness of these strategies can be explained through the associative network. All right, so then we moved on to categorization. So here, basically the idea is that as we saw in the Torah model, people form attitudes, and these attitudes are important because the more positive the attitude toward a brand, the higher the chance that it might actually be bought or selected. So in thinking about how people form attitudes, I think it's important to understand how categorization works. So in general, there are two kinds of ways in which categorical information comes to mind. And one is the more top-down category, right? Which is you think about the country of origin of a product or the product category to which a product belongs, like Samsung phones, right? Country of origin is Korea, and it's a smartphone. And so whatever set of associations you have with Korea or with smartphones, you're going to kind of basically also apply them to this particular product, right? You're going to consider that this product too has those associations. And of course, you can have bottom-up influences as well. So how well it performs, what its price is, and how much value for money it seems to offer, how does it look? All of those are attribute information that also affects attitudes toward that product. So this has some implications, right? So if you're in a particular product category, if you're a smartphone, then if you're a Samsung, you're automatically going to be compared to an Apple, right? So how might you be able to avoid it? And sometimes you might want to avoid it, right? Because Apple is the market leader, right? Let's say, then you don't necessarily want to be compared to Apple. You might try and introduce a completely new category to which your phone belongs now, right? So I don't know what that might be for a smartphone, but we have had examples in other categories. So when Red Bull came into the market, right, the prevalent kind of categories in beverages were soft drinks and hot beverages like coffee, tea, etc. So it invented this new category called energy drinks, right? So that didn't used to exist. When Chrysler came into the market with the minivan, that was the first time that anybody saw a minivan. Until then, we used to have cars or sedans and perhaps convertibles and things like that, or buses, but not minivans. And so one way in which you can avoid comparisons with other competing brands is through inventing a new category. You might also have country of origin associations that are not necessarily positive. I mentioned the example of Jaguar, right? Bought by Tata, which is an Indian company. And they haven't changed the name from Jaguar to anything that's Indian. They don't even, in fact, advertise the fact that it's Tata that owns Jaguar now. And there's a reason for it, right? Because India is not known necessarily for being technologically advanced, at least as of now, right? Okay, so then we moved on to this module on judgment, heuristics, and biases, right? It's one of my favorite topics. I don't know if you guys enjoyed it too, but basically, judgment heuristics are rules of thumb that people use, and these rules of thumb influence their decisions. So there are three main judgment heuristics that we need to remember, right? There are more, but these three are, the most important ones. Availability is the first one that we discussed, and basically what it says is that the more easily something comes to mind, the higher the chance that that's going to be thought to be more liked or more risky or more higher quantity and so on and so forth, okay? Representativeness is basically like stereotyping. The more a particular stimulus seems like it belongs to a super or the category of stimulus, those associations are going to be brought to mind. So, for example, if you have a soap that's in blue packaging, right? Blue means water, blue means fresh. You might think of the soap as being fresh too, right? If it's in green packaging, you might think of that as being organic or natural, etc. We also talked about anchoring. So the idea here is that people kind of are persuaded by, or at least influenced by, arbitrary anchors that you might supply them with. So for example, if you have people write down the last 2 digits of their social security number and then ask them, will you pay an amount higher to it or equal to it to buy a bottle of wine? Let's say your last 2 digits are 98. You might say, no, there's no way that I'll buy a bottle of wine for $98. But then if you're followed up with a question, how much would you be willing to pay for it? People might actually come up with a higher number than if their last 2 digits were, let's say, 14, right? If you have 1-4, you might say, yeah, I'd be willing to pay $14 for a bottle of wine. How much would you actually pay for a bottle of wine? You might say $20 maybe, right? But if your last 2 digits are 98, then you might say, oh, I'd be willing to pay up to $50, right? So people are persuaded or influenced by these arbitrary anchors, and we see a lot of marketers kind of taking advantage of it. So they might have the original price, so to speak, which is much higher, and then put a line across it, slash it, and say, now it's on sale. And it might have never sold at that higher price ever, right? But people are still influenced by those arbitrary anchors. One thing to remember is that all these heuristics are useful in life. They make life simpler, but they also may lead to biases, which leads to the next topic. So biases are gaps between objective judgments and perceived judgments. Okay, and there's lots of different biases that we discussed. We talked about confirmation bias or confidence bias. There's 6 different kinds of biases. I think I might have also mentioned a couple of others, but these are the important ones to remember. And we also talked about how to reduce biases, right? Through knowledge, through learning about the biases, right? Through reviewing our own decisions from the past. Maybe we, signed up to go to the gym, and we discover now that we're just wasting money paying a subscription to the gym. And that's because we were overconfident, right? So that means that we might be susceptible to overconfidence biases. That's reviewing. We can also ask other people for feedback. And the idea here is that we might be blind to our own biases, but hopefully others aren't, and others are willing to be honest with us. So that might be another way in which we overcome the biases. Okay, then we moved on to satisfaction, right? So it's the kind of post-decisional phase. So satisfaction is attitude based on experience. We can measure it with surveys. We talked about 2 different kinds of models of satisfaction, disconfirmation and attribution. And the idea in disconfirmation is that the most important determinant of satisfaction is the difference between what is expected and what you actually experienced. And over time, people form these expectations based off of their past experience. And so if you're a brand that offers high quality, actually, you're kind of like shooting yourself in the foot a little bit, because the next time the consumer is going to be expecting a high level of performance, right? So how do you kind of overcome the problem that's associated with setting high expectations and performing really well? We talked about the hooks and surprises model, where you set certain high expectations in order to draw them in, but then you surprise them with a certain set of attributes that you've not advertised, or the consumer does not expect those things. So that's the way in which you can kind of overcome the negative byproduct of being a good performer, right? The attribution model applies in contexts in which there is a negative disconfirmation. So you've set high expectations, you perform really badly, then 3 kinds of thoughts come to consumers' minds. One is how often does it happen? It's called stability, right? The other is focus. Who's responsible for this? In general, the brand is blamed, even if in reality there's some other cause, because the brand is more available, right? If an airline is delayed, people tend to blame the airline rather than the weather, right? And the third is control, and that has to do with what is this marketer or brand trying to do in order to address this problem, right? So if you kind of tackle each of those things, then you might be able to mitigate the negative attitude that the consumers might have, even if you fail, right? So this is where complaint management comes into the picture. In general, I think that you need to kind of tackle each of those 3 types of thoughts that consumers have. And sometimes you have to be upfront and say, you know what, I screwed up, right? So people like that vulnerability as well, which we saw in the Airbnb example. I don't know if you guys remember it. Okay, so another 5 minutes, hopefully I'll be done. So social influence is another big topic we talked about, right? Social influence applies across all of these different stages as well. And we talked about this idea that in this day and age in particular, right, social influence is huge, because back in the day, you as a consumer didn't really have the capability of talking about a brand or a product to other consumers, or even if it did, it was kind of restricted to you, the people you came in touch with physically, right? But in this day and age, because of the social media, you have access to, pretty much the whole world, right? And so if you're an influencer, you can actually reach a lot of people. And the influencer's influence is actually greater than that of the marketer's influence, because influencers are more credible, right? These are everyday people like you and me, and presumably they don't have a conflict of interest. They're not being paid by the company to say positive things. And so they're more credible, and the reach is improved now over time, right? And one of the other aspects that we talked about is interactivity, right? So if it's mass media, then it's not going to be interactive, but if it's going to be one-on-one, then it's going to be more interactive. So as a marketer, you need to understand how social influence happens. And we talked about these 6 kind of norms of social influence, or 6 rules of social influence. I won't go through them, but you can go back and take a look at the slides on them. And then we moved on to conjoint analysis, right? So this is more of a assignment that you guys did, but you might have a question or two on this in the exam too, okay? So basically, you have to understand what the procedure is in conjoint analysis and where it comes into the picture, right? The idea is that the Torah model assumes that people can come up with these importance ratings for different brands, but in reality, that's not really a realistic assumption, right? So what we know is that consumers can come up with their overall preference, right? They can say that this is the brand that I choose, or this is how much I like a particular option. You as a marketer can control the number of features for a particular option, right? You might say for a GPS device that, I can control the accuracy, or I can control whether it's got a black and white screen or a color screen and so on. And you can also control the level of the feature, right? These are the number of features, number of attributes, the level of the feature. And what consumers find difficult to do is to rate the importance of each of the features. But if you have these 3 things, right, this thing we can elicit from consumers, these things we can fix as a marketer, then we can use conjoint in order to back out or back up their importance ratings, okay? So that's the idea. And once you do that, it's very useful because you can answer questions like, how much would a consumer pay for a higher level of feature or attribute? How much would a consumer be willing to pay for attribute of certain kinds of features, right? And if different consumers are willing to pay different amounts, then that means that there are various segments and so on and so forth. All right, so 2 more topics that we covered, experiential marketing and branding. And the idea here in experiential marketing is that ultimately people seem to make decisions based on emotions much, much more than on logic or rationality, even though they do use logic and rationality to justify their emotionally made decisions, right? So this is the hedonic dominance functional prominence principle. We talked about the definition of an experiential economy, where marketers use service as a stage and goods as props in order to create a memorable experience, right? We talked about examples from toothbrushes to hospitals to banks to cell phones, etc. So it's across the board. We see a progression toward experiential economy. And the reason why we seem to be in an experience economy is because that's where, as a whole, the critical mass of people seem to be in certain contexts at least, right? So we've progressed through meeting physiological needs to safety needs to ego needs to now higher up on the Maslow's hierarchy, we seem to be closer to an experience economy. And that means that consumers will be willing to pay more for an experiential offering because it captures more value, it offers more value. It's not only, for example, in the birthday cake, not only satisfying hunger and convenience, but also aesthetic needs, right? And what's next? Maybe a self-actualization economy. We talked about that too. And we talked about steps in an experiential marketing campaign. These are the 4 steps, right? Okay. Finally, we talked about branding. And this is the study of long-term consumer decision-making. And branding is about influencing longer term, right? And strong brands confer a lot of advantages. We talked about at least 6 advantages. You can charge a higher price. You can, have more kind of channels of distribution available to you from the retailer. You can license your brand across many different kinds of products, et cetera, et cetera. And brands can be improved through enhancing brand equity, knowledge about the brand. That's how we define brand equity, right? Knowledge about the brand that influences consumers' decisions. The knowledge comes in two varieties, right? It's just plain awareness, how familiar a person is with the brand, or consumers are with the brand, and also the associations, right? That's knowledge too, in people's memory about a brand. And these, ideally, these associations are SFIU, right? Strong, favorable, important, and unique. And that's what you want with your brand. And you also want to forge your brand with certain personality traits that are consistent with whatever it is that you're offering. If you're a car, perhaps you want to go with excitement, right? If you are a university, perhaps you want to go with competence, etc. Okay, and you have to remember that co-branding can be profitable, but you have to do it with some care. All right. Whew. A lot of information there. Okay, so let's do the mock exam, guys. I'm going to give you guys 15 minutes to do it. So that'll leave us with about 5 minutes. Hmm? But act as if it's going to be created. Yeah. Sorry.
What's the I stand for?
I
In the SFIU.
in the what?
SFIU.
SFIU, important.
Oh, okay.
So the importance is going to be dependent on the target market, right? So, for example, if you're an airline, flight might be really important for the leisure travel. For business travel, not so much. So it might be punctuality might be more important for business travel.
Yes.
No, I mean, non-marketing content. So something with how we really realistic might like people judgment. So you can look, yeah, yeah.
Is there any like?
No, so everything that's here, right? The same. Yeah, no, it's something. Is it on? There's a part C too, okay, on the question, so don't miss that part. It's on the very last page. So if you've finished the mock exam, you can open up your laptop, and I've sent you all an email that has the key to the exam as well as the grading rubric. But don't do this until you actually finish writing out your answer, okay? It'll be more useful for you to look at the key after you've answered the questions. No, this is just for practice. Are you disappointed? That's good. It's good. Go to town. Yeah. It's good practice. I think it'll give you a better idea of how well prepared you are if you do take it seriously, right? All right, another minute and a half, guys. All right, so finish up in another minute and a half. This is the kind of pace that you'll be expected to go at in the final exam, just FYI. All right, another 10 seconds. Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes, so I'm only going to go through the multiple choice questions. If you have any questions, if you disagree with me on the answer, then we can have a conversation. But I'll let you go through the answer key to the short essay questions on your own. Okay. Again, if you have any questions on that, you can email me. But here are the answers to the multiple choice. Right, a choice heuristic can be best explained as a simplifying rule of thumb that facilitates quick decision making. Right, it's not a judgment to which consumers arrive. Right. It's not a process by which consumers evaluate various brands. A Torah model would be a process by which consumers evaluate various brands, but a choice heuristic is a simplifying rule of thumb. Okay. The following are the two broad categories by which consumers search for information, right? We talked about it in the review. It's internal and external, right? You can search for stuff inside your own mind or externally. Third question, what are sense, act, relate, etc. And you could also add feel and think to them, right? So those are the five so-called strategic experiential modules. So that's the right answer for that. And question 4. So what did you guys get for this one? What is the answer to this? C, right? And the why is it C? Anybody want to explain why? Yeah, Samhita? Right. So if you want to assess the strength of a brand, right, what better way to do it than to kind of equate two options on every other attribute except the brand name, right? And therefore, you'll be able to assess how much more people are willing to pay for the brand name. Okay, and question number 5 is what? A, sleeper effect, right?
On 4,
Mhm.
I was between B and C,
Mhm.
and because I could argue like
Mhm.
well-known brands do have different associations than
Mhm.
brands.
But that is generally true, right? Is not true only for pharmaceuticals. If you look at the first line of the question, the category of pharmaceuticals is particularly useful. Why? So each of these statements by themselves could be true, but you have to assess which is the best answer given the question, right? Not,
But it's an R identifier, not all.
but the-
But typically we are.
yeah, that is what the FDA says. You know, the FDA says that for you to be a pill in a particular product, I think you have to be. All right. Yes, Peyton? No. Heuristic means rule of thumb. Judgment heuristics help people arrive at judgment. Choice heuristics help people. Not judgment. All right. I'll see you guys on Wednesday. All right, so expect some students to get back to you and point out the reasons why they got points taken off. So I hope you have explanations for why. Hello, you've been, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it can't go on digital devices, that's all.
Okay.
I saw your email this morning, so I was gonna ask, would you want me to do all 6?
No,
Or
just one is good.
one okay?
Yeah, whichever you find the simplest to
Yeah,
do.
okay.
Just don't overcomplicate it, man.
Yeah.
Just go back to
Cause
look
if
at
I
the
went back and I didn't draw all 6, I was like, oh, doing that in Excel would take forever, so I would just
But-
do one and.
Yeah. I didn't imagine that somebody would use something else. You know, everything is like, because we went through Excel, right? And he's only familiar with Excel.
Yeah,
So unfortunately, we can't grade it if it's on.
yeah, no worries, I can do it for one person. Cool, thank you.
Sounds good.